Hi folks, HR Funk here, with the third and final installment in a video series that I started several weeks ago where I'm comparing two very similar optics. One is the Cvlife Bear Power 4-16 by 44mm rifle scope. The other is a Vortex Viper PST Generation 2 3-15 by 44mm scope. And I have a ton of data to convey to all of you today. I spent all day yesterday on the range, and I really have a challenge in this video when it comes to trying to condense and compose all of this information into a concise and intelligible format. But I'm going to do my best, so here we go. Before we get into the real substance of this video, I want to say that if you have not seen the previous two installments in this series, you're not going to get as much out of this one as you otherwise might. In the previous two videos, I conducted an up-close shop review where I covered all of the features and characteristics of each of these two scopes, and I also talked about why it was that I was producing this series. In brief, I will say that these are very similar optics behind me here in many respects, but one place that they differ significantly is in their price. The Cvlife Bear Power Scope sells on Amazon for about $200, whereas the Vortex Viper PST Generation 2 has an MSRP on the Vortex website of about $1,400, but with a little bit of shopping, you can find it retailing a lot of places for quite a bit less than that. Generally, what I'm seeing online and different places where I've looked at the scope is it's selling between about $850 and $1,000. So you could literally get 4 or 5 of the Cvlife scopes for the price of one Vortex Viper PST. And I'm trying to examine whether or not you're really getting 4 or 5 times more performance from the more expensive optic than you are from the less expensive one. So with that little bit of an introduction out of the way, let's take a close-up look at these two scopes, and I'll start to talk about some of the things that I was able to determine when I took them both to the range. The first thing I want to do as I start into this video is say that no, I did not have these scopes mounted like this yesterday when I was at the range, because somewhere out there is the person who's going to come into the comment section and tell me this is not the way you use rifle scopes, you can't look through one and then through another. I know that. I have them set up like this just for ease of reference, so as I'm talking about various things, I can quickly point out what I'm talking about on either scope. The next thing I want to point out are just some general comments with regard to the testing that I performed and how it was conducted. First off, I used the exact same testing protocol for both optics. All the shooting was done with this rifle, so I didn't shoot one optic with one rifle, one optic with a different rifle, or what have you. I used the exact same ammunition, and I went through the exact same procedures with both. When I first got to the range, the Cvlife Bear Power scope was already installed in the rings and mounted to the rifle, so I kicked things off with that, and I went all the way through the testing with it. Then I removed it from the rings. I installed the Vortex Viper PST Gen 2 right there at the range. I took my torque wrench along, so I torqued it down to the proper specification for these rings, and then I repeated the exact same testing procedure with this scope. So these were as close to exact back-to-back comparisons as I could. The atmospheric conditions were pretty much the same all day long. It was a bright, sunny day, so I wasn't dealing with any kind of clouds or low light conditions or anything in this portion of the test. I'll get to some adverse lighting tests later on that I did. When I first got there with each scope, the first thing that I tried to do was to get some images through the scope so you would be able to see what the clarity looked like and the brightness of the image and everything else. And I took one photo with the magnification on the lowest setting. Then I turned it to the middle setting, which for the Cvlife scope, since it's a 4-16 power, the middle setting was 10 power. For the Vortex Viper, since it's a 3-15 power scope, the middle setting was 9 power. Anyway, I took the second image through the scope with it at that middle setting. Then I turned it up to the maximum magnification on this scope, the Cvlife, that's 16 power. On the Vortex Viper, it's 15 power. And I took the final image through there. The image that you see when you're actually looking through the scope with your eye is much, much better than the images that you're going to see that I was taking through these optics. And I really just don't have the equipment yet to be able to get really good images through a rifle scope. I wish I did. I wish I could show you exactly what they were going to look like when you're looking through them with your eye, but I just can't do it yet. Hopefully I'll have something I can do that with in the future, but right now the images that you're seeing are the best that I could do. In general terms, I thought the image quality through both scopes was very, very good. I didn't notice any distortion around the edges from either one. I didn't notice any chromatic aberrations. Now, some people seem to notice that every time they look through anything with glass, they see some sort of chromatic aberration. I wasn't able to see that, again, with either scope. The colors all looked good, the contrast looked good. And really, at least under bright, sunny conditions, I couldn't see any difference in brightness or image clarity from the less expensive CV Power Scope to the much more expensive Vortex Viper Scope. So I'll talk later on about what I was seeing under low light conditions, but if you only are ever going out and shooting on a bright sunny day, or at least you're never shooting under adverse lighting conditions, you're probably not going to get very much better performance with regard to image clarity, brightness, etc. from the more expensive Vortex scope than you're getting from the more value-priced Cvlife. Something you probably noticed when you were looking at those images that I was taking through the scopes was this target. And no, this is not the way this target came from the printer. I actually put this diagram on the target, and each of these dots that you see that I put on here is exactly 4 minutes of angle center to center from the next, which means it's just under 4.2 inches center to center from each one of these dots. The reason I used 4 minutes of angle is because both of the reticles for these scopes have the larger hash marks at every 4 minute of angle increment along their stadia. So I thought this made a convenient way to check the calibration of those reticles. So after I finished taking the images, the next thing I did was to compare the hash marks that are on the reticle to my calibrated target. And any of you who have ever done any measuring with a scope's reticle know that you have to hold it absolutely motionless to get the best measurement, which is difficult to do. But as close as I could come to holding each of the optics, or I should say maybe the rifle, absolutely motionless and gauging those hash marks against my calibrated target, it looked like they both were very accurate for their minute of angle markings in the reticle. So I didn't see any problem with either scope checking that right out of the gates when I started my test. The next thing I wanted to look at was the brightness level of the illuminated reticle in each of these scopes. And I have said before that I don't use illumination on a bright sunny day with one exception, and that is if I'm shooting at a very dark colored target or a black target, and the reticle lines, since they are black when you look through the scope, sometimes will be somewhat indistinct on that very dark colored or black target. Under those circumstances, I might try to use some illumination just to give me some contrast to be able to place a more accurate shot. And in testing both of these scopes, what I'll tell you is neither one of them have a brightness level that is high enough to be able to see under bright daylight conditions. With the Cvlife scope at the max brightness setting, I was able to see just a little bit of a reddish pinkish twinge to the cross in the very center of the reticle, but it really did not provide sufficient contrast to be able to use for aiming purposes. With the Vortex Viper scope, oddly, it was just the opposite. The very center of the reticle had no visible illumination whatsoever, but there was a little bit of that reddish pinkish twinge to the outside edges of the stadia line. So for whatever reason, they were different in that regard, but neither one of them had a usable brightness setting that would be able to help you place a better shot under bright daylight conditions. So to this point in the test, in terms of image quality And brightness settings, I would say it's pretty much a draw between these two optics, and the value price Cvlife is definitely holding its own with the more expensive Vortex Viper. The next order of business was to zero these two scopes, and before I get into a discussion of the zeroing process, I want to make a quick point with regard to these rings. These are Cvlife rings that come with the Cvlife scope. And when I conducted my review of the scope itself, I mentioned that I have heard more than one person say you should not use these rings, they're poor quality, you should just take them and throw them away or whatever, and go out and buy yourself some new rings. And I didn't find that to be the case. I used these with both scopes. I torqued them down to the top rail of the rifle. I torqued down the ring caps to the ring bases, and I didn't have any problems. There was no issue with eye relief. I didn't have to use a cantilever mount. Now you can see that I have this front ring all the way in the forward groove of my rail on the upper receiver. But it worked fine. As I said, eye relief was no problem. There was no slipping, moving, or anything of the scopes while I was shooting. And when I started zeroing, both scopes came from the manufacturer at mechanical zero, and I started my rough zero at 25 yards, and they were both pretty close at 25 yards to the final zero. There was, I think, about a 2-inch deviation with the Cvlife scope. It hit about 2 inches low at 25 yards and about 2 inches left. So it was definitely, on paper, it was close enough that I could have started the zero process at 100 yards with a human silhouette type target and been on paper. And the Vortex Viper was just about the same place after I mounted it. So what that tells me is these rings correspond very well to the top rail of the upper receiver, and also they are very closely aligned to the bore axis of the rifle. And I don't know why people complain about these things. Now, I don't know if they are going to withstand impacts like more expensive rings. I don't know if you can throw them out of an airplane or drive over them with a tank or anything like that. But for just going out to the range, mounting the scopes, and shooting them, I had no problems whatsoever. And what I would say is, if you buy a Cvlife scope and it comes with these rings, try them out. See if they're going to work for you. If they do, then you're all set. If not, you can always purchase different rings later. So that's my spiel on the Cvlife rings. One quick comment I want to make before I get into the zeroing process with each one of these optics has to do with something I mentioned a moment ago, which is I started my rough zero at a distance of 25 yards, and there was no problem whatsoever dialing the side focus parallax down to that distance of 25 yards. In fact, the Vortex Viper goes all the way down to 20 yards, and the Cvlife scope goes down to 10 yards. So if you're using this scope on a 22 rimfire or something like that, you're going to be shooting at relatively close distances, or even an air rifle for that matter, you could bring it all the way down to 10 yards with an air rifle and not have any problem with the focus. So I thought that was very cool with both scopes, and I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out. So on we go to zeroing, and the zeroing process for both of these scopes is similar, but there are a couple of little differences. One of the things that I was doing with both of these in conjunction with zeroing the optic was to also set the zero stop. Both of these have a zero stop feature, and the design of those zero stops is different, which means the way you zero the scope is somewhat different. And I'm probably going to have to talk about them one at a time and explain the individual variances with regard to how this zeroing process takes place, as well as how the zero stop works. So I did start things off with the Cvlife scope, and I'm going to roll in some footage from the range so you'll be able to see some of what I was doing while I was doing it. Essentially, in order to zero the Cvlife Bear Power scope and set the zero stop, you first have to remove the 3 set screws around the circumference of the turret cap. This is pretty common with scopes, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but I don't like this arrangement. Both of these optics, both the Cvlife and the Vortex Viper, have this exact same system for securing the elevation turret cap, and I don't like it. I wish manufacturers would come up with a different way to go about this. And as I said, I'll tell you why in a little bit. But first you remove those 3 set screws and lift the cap off. And what I found is it was pretty difficult to get this cap off. And it was even more difficult later on to get it back on. I don't know if there was a burr inside here left over from manufacturing. I don't know if there was some other issue, but it did not want to come off there. I kept backing these out a little farther and a little farther, and I don't think that was the issue. There was something that was actually sticking, holding this cap in place. Anyway, when I finally got it off, inside is the zero stop itself, which essentially is a ring. It also has set screws around a circumference that you have to loosen, and then you completely remove that ring. On the bottom of that ring, there is a projection that butts up against a corresponding projection on the brass turret, and I'll try to get you close-ups of these so you can see exactly how they fit together. Once you finish that, after you remove the zero stop, you replace the turret cap, tighten down the screws around the circumference, and then begin your zero process. Now, I told you a moment ago it was difficult to get this thing off. It was even more difficult to get it back on. I had to work with it and push and sort of wiggle it around, and I was pushing hard enough that when it finally snapped in place, this bottom edge right here and the top of the turret that you see right there pinched the devil out of my thumb. It didn't draw blood, but I guess I still got a blood blister there, as you can kind of see. And I didn't like that too well, so there is some machining that could be a little bit better quality with the Cvlife scope. It's a $200 scope, so I'm not overwhelmingly surprised to see an issue like that. It required just a little bit of Marine Corps engineering to get that thing jammed back on there. Once I did, then I was able to conduct my zeroing without any more problems. The click adjustments, as best I could tell, were moving about the proper quarter minute of angle for each increment. I didn't have any problem with that. I got a rough zero at 25 yards very quickly, moved out to 100 yards, and completed my zeroing process there. After that, I have to, once again, remove this turret. Then when you replace the zero stop, as I said, that little projection goes up against the side of the corresponding brass projection on the turret itself, and you need to make sure you put it on the correct side. If you were looking at it from the top down, the zero stop, the plastic ring itself, the projection from that would be on the counterclockwise side of the brass projection that is on the turret itself. Again, I'll try to get close-up views of these in the photographs so you can see exactly what I was talking about. But overall, the zeroing wasn't difficult, other than those things that I mentioned with regard to the cap being stiff to get back on, or stiff to get off and difficult to get back on. And this is the thing that I really dislike about these 3 set screws around the circumference of the turret cap, and that has to do with when you are re-indexing to 0. And let me move the camera here. In order to re-index your 0 marking, you have to put it back onto the turret so the line for 0 lines up exactly with the marking that you can see underneath here. And you have to hold it perfectly still as you tighten down these 3 set screws. And that's a very tedious process, and I'm one of these kind of people. I want this line to be exactly indexed with the marking on the scope body itself, and each time I turn the turret from one click to the next, I want each corresponding tick mark on the circumference of the turret cap to exactly line up with that index mark that we can see underneath. If it's off a little bit one way or the other, that bugs me. And it is very difficult, and this is not the only scope that uses that. As I said, the Vortex Viper has that exact same system. There are a lot of other scope manufacturers out there that use that exact system, and I don't know how many times I have zeroed a scope and tried to get that thing re-indexed and had to repeat the process over and over again. It's not difficult while you're trying to hold everything together to accidentally click a couple of elevation clicks one way or the other. Then you have to stop, try to make sure you know how many. If it goes all of a sudden and you don't know how many clicks went by, then you've got to reset or retest by shooting to see where the zero is and whether or not you've got it back to the proper place. I just very, very much dislike that. All you scope manufacturers out there, come up with a way that we can re-index the scope cap to the zero marking without having to mess with these little set screws and have that wiggling back and forth and jiggling and turning and everything else and putting clicks of elevation on or taking them off or whatever in the process. There has got to be a better way to do that. So aside from my annoyance with this 3 set screw arrangement and the turret cap sticking and not wanting to come off and then having to force it back on and receiving an injury to my thumb, the rest of the process went pretty smoothly. And once I got everything all reassembled, it works the way it's supposed to work. Now, one of the things that I do when I install a zero stop is I actually set it so I can go 2 minutes of angle below my zero to compensate for changes in ammunition or temperature or other environmental conditions or what have you. So if I have to click down a few clicks below zero, I can do that. It still functions as a zero stop, and I know when I hit that stop, all I have to do is come back up, in this instance, 8 clicks, and I am right back to my original zero. So that's one of the things I do. If you want to do that, you can. Obviously, if you don't want to, you don't have to. Moving on to the Vortex Viper scope, the process for this zero is very similar to one that I just explained with the Cvlife scope. Once again, we have those 3 annoying set screws around the circumference of the turret cap, and when those are loosened, you raise the cap off of the turret itself, but I did not have the issue getting this off and definitely did not have the issue putting it back on later that I had with the Cvlife scope. Once you remove this turret cap, underneath you will again find the zero stop, which also again has 3 set screws around its circumference. Loosening those 3 set screws is necessary in order to set the zero stop, but you do not, in this instance, remove the zero stop. It stays in place. Underneath, on the turret itself, is another set of indexing numbers, and when the zero stop is loosened, there are no clicks, but you have to use those markings in order to be able to establish your zero for the rifle. So it's simply just a friction movement of the turret itself while you're setting your zero, and you have to gauge your minute of angle increments by the markings on the turret itself. I don't really like that. I don't like the fact that they designed this so you don't have clicks when you are establishing your zero for the optic. For a scope in this price range, I wouldn't expect something like that. I would sooner expect that the Cvlife scope would have something like that with no clicks available while you're zeroing than I would with a $800 to $1,000 Vortex Viper. I just did not like that procedure. It worked well enough, I guess, but you have to keep watching the little markings on the turret itself, and I don't typically do that. I typically look through the scope, I see where the shot hit, I calculate the difference in minutes of angle, and then I click my way through, in this case, 1/4 minute of angle clicks, whatever number I need to bring my point of impact into correspondence with my point of aim. And with this, you can't do it that way. You have to stop and actually watch these little markings and make sure you're dialing the right number. I found that to be kind of tedious, and like I said, I just didn't think that was a real great system for a scope in this price range. In any case, I was able to establish a zero and put everything back together. The turret cap went back on much easier, and again, I went through that same tedious and annoying process of trying to hold the turret cap exactly still as I was tightening down the set screws, and it was just as much of a pain as it always is. But I did manage to get both optics zeroed. With regard to the windage turret of the Vortex Viper, when it comes to zeroing, the process is exactly the same as for the elevation turret, except there's no zero stop to deal with. So you establish your zero, you once again have the 3 annoying set screws, you have to remove the turret cap, re-index the zero marking to the index mark on the scope body itself, and then re-tighten down the 3 annoying set screws. Finally, I can talk about re-indexing a turret in a way that I really liked, or at least vastly preferred over what I've described so far, and that is with the Windage turret on the Cvlife scope. This turret, when you push it in against the scope body, locks it in place. This does not have the 3 annoying set screws, rather it has this one large slotted screw right here on the outside of the turret itself. So when I push this against the scope body and lock it in place, I can use a screwdriver or a coin or whatever and remove this screw, and the turret is not going to move. I don't have to worry about those clicks being added one way or the other. It is locked by virtue of the fact that it's pushed against the scope body. Once I remove the screw, I can remove the turret cap, turn it to the index marking so it lines up with the marking on the scope body itself, put it in place, and again push it all the way against the scope body so it locks in place, and then reinstall my big screw. This is much, much better, in my opinion, than this 3 set screw arrangement that was on every other turret that I was working with yesterday. So again, hint to the scope manufacturers out there, come up with something like this that we can use on the elevation turret, where it will lock in place. I don't have to worry about it moving, clicking, or anything else, and I can reinstall a screw or resecure it in whatever way and not have it move at all during the process. So after establishing a 0 with both optics, the next thing I wanted to do was shoot them at varying magnifications to see if there was any drift in the point of impact associated with turning the magnification ring. And this is something, particularly on lesser expensive optics, you'll run into sometimes, where you zero the optics, say, at the highest magnification setting, and then if for some reason you dial it back to a lower setting, you will get a deviation in your point of impact. So what I did was I started out with both optics at the lowest magnification setting. With the Vortex Viper, that was a setting of 3 power, and with the Cvlife Bear Power Scope, that was a setting of 4 power. And one thing that I want to mention is that with both of these scopes dialed to the minimum magnification level, the reticle in daylight conditions is almost unusable. With the first focal plane scopes, that reticle gets so small and it is so fine to begin with that it's almost invisible. You can just sort of barely see it in there, or at least I can. Maybe somebody with better eyes will be able to pick that up easier, but it was very difficult for me to be able to see. And I also want to mention that the magnification ring on the Vortex Viper scope is extremely stiff. And this thing, with the throw lever on the Cvlife scope, this works worlds easier than this ring on the Vortex Viper scope. Again, with a scope that is in this price range, to be that much more stiff than the one that I have here on the $200 optic is something that I really was disappointed by. Now, some of you have mentioned that there is an aftermarket throw lever that you can get for the Vortex Viper scopes, and maybe as this scope gets used more and more, that will get easier and easier to turn, but I just didn't care for that. It's almost to the point that it somewhat impairs you when you're trying to make a quick change in magnification, as opposed to just being able to grab that throw lever and spin it back and forth. And this came with the throw lever for $200, but you do not get one with the Vortex Viper for $850. And here are the results of shooting both of those optics at varying magnification levels. All of this shooting was done at a distance of 100 yards. The target you see on top was the Cvlife scope, and the target you see on the bottom was with the Vortex Viper. And I found it interesting that when I started out on the lowest magnification level, which was 4 power for the Cvlife and 3 power for the Viper, that even though I was having all that difficulty seeing the reticle that I mentioned a moment ago, both shots, first off, I was very happy that both shots were even on the target. I was a little concerned about that. But not only were they on the target, but they both hit low to almost the exact same degree. So something about looking for that very small reticle and trying to line it up caused me to put those bullets in just about the same place. Next, I moved up to the middle magnification range, which was 10 power for the Cvlife and 9 power for the Vortex Viper, and I fired these two shots. This one made me think maybe that Cvlife scope was starting to show some deviation as I went through different levels of magnification. This shot was a little high at a distance of 100 yards with the Vortex Viper, but not enough that I was really concerned about it. The zeros that I had established prior to this point were working zeros, but I really don't feel comfortable with a zero until I have shot with that rifle and that optic several times and gotten comfortable with it. It's very possible that with the Vortex Viper, I need to come down a click or two and maybe left a click or two in order to get a absolutely perfect 100-yard zero. So I wasn't concerned when I saw this with regard to the points of impact for the 10 power, the 9 power and 15 power shots. I was concerned by this one though. So after firing these two shots at the mid-range, I went to the highest magnification range, which for the Cvlife is 16 power. That one impacted right here, and I thought, okay, so we're back to the windage being pretty much in line with what I saw at the lowest magnification setting. I fired this shot with the Vortex Viper on 15 power, no problem whatsoever with that one, but I was really wondering about that middle magnification shot that I fired with the Cvlife scope, so I went back to 10 power again and I fired another shot. This one was pretty much right dead center, so that tells me this shot that I fired was either a poor shot on my part or maybe there was some issue with that cartridge or whatever. But in any regard, I don't think I'm seeing any shift in point of impact with the different magnification levels on the Cvlife scope. And I'm definitely not seeing anything in the Vortex Viper scope that's going to cause me any concern. Next up was a tracking test for both scopes, and once again this was from a distance of 100 yards, and I have tried to give these shot holes some contrast so you can tell which one goes with the Cvlife scope and which ones go with the Vortex scope. Behind the shots for the Cvlife scope I have yellow stickers. Hopefully you can see those showing up yellow through there. And the shots for the Vortex Viper, I have blue stickers behind there, so hopefully that's coming through on the camera. When I conducted this test, my point of aim for every shot that I fired was right here in the center of this sticker. When I started out, I fired one shot, beginning with the Cvlife scope, and this was shot number 1 with the Cvlife scope. After that, I came up 2.5 minutes of angle and right 2.5 minutes of angle. Again, using this as my aiming point, I fired this shot. Then I came up a total of 5 minutes of angle and fired this shot, once again using this as my point of aim. Then I came left 5 minutes of angle, same point of aim, fired this shot, down 5 minutes of angle, this shot, and then 2.5 minutes of angle to the right, 2.5 minutes of angle down, and fired this shot. So as far as tracking and returning to zero, we've got those two shots from the Cvlife scope that are within probably less than 3/4 of an inch center to center. So very good returning to zero. The tracking isn't bad. Maybe we're getting a little bit more than 5 minutes of angle coming across here, but it's not horrible. And this could be one of these things where you've just got to work with your scope and learn what the proper number of clicks or come-ups or whatever that you need at varying distances or for varying wind conditions or what have you. That's just part of gaining experience with your optic and being able to employ it to the best of its ability. With a scope in the $200 range, I'm not feeling all too bad about that, and I'm actually feeling pretty good about how close it returned to zero. With the Vortex Viper, my first shot was here. Again, up 2.5 minutes of angle, right 2.5 minutes of angle, keeping the same point of aim. Shot hit right here, so that's very good. Up 5 minutes of angle, fired this shot. Left 5 minutes of angle, this shot. Down 5 minutes of angle, hit right here. 2.5 minutes right, 2.5 minutes down, and we're right back here. These are, that might be an inch center to center. maybe just a little bit shy of that. So again, return to 0 with both in going through this entire tracking test was very good. And as far as any deviation in the point of impact for these shots, there's probably some shooter error in there. There could be some other issues as well. I don't think there's really any problem with the tracking that I'm seeing here. For my final test with these two scopes, or at least the final test that I was conducting at the range, I decided to do a max turret test. So what I did was ran the elevation turret as far up as it would go, and then all the way down to the 0 stop to reestablish the 0. Then the windage turret, I turned it right to the limit of its movement. Then I came back all the way left to the limit of its movement, returned it to 0, and then fired a shot on my calibrated target. And I'll move over there and show you the point of impact after all that with the Cvlife scope. So after all that dialing to the maximum range of the elevation and windage turrets and then returning to 0, I fired this shot and it could not have been much better. So I was very pleased to see that with the Cvlife scope. I think that was very good performance, especially for a value price scope. When I conducted my max turret adjustment test with the Vortex Viper scope, I encountered my biggest problem of this entire test. Now, just as I did with the Cvlife scope, I ran this all the way to the top of the elevation and then all the way back down. And what I noticed when I got all the way to the bottom limit of the rotation is the indicator bar on top of this turret was not pointed straight back at me as it should have been had the 0 stop worked properly. Rather, it was about 2/3 of a revolution to the rear of the turret, or facing away from me, maybe I should say. I thought that the 0 stop had failed and that I was about 2/3 of a revolution from my 0, so I turned this back to where the indicator was pointing back toward me again, and I thought that was my 0. Of course, the 0 marking on the turret lined up with the indicator mark on the scope itself. Then I performed the exact same test with the windage turret all the way to the right, then all the way to the left, then back to 0. And when I fired my shot on the calibrated target, which I'll show you momentarily, I knew instantly there was a problem. So after rotating the windage and elevation turrets on the Vortex Viper to the maximum limits of their range, I again fired a shot at 100 yards on this target. And I knew immediately there was a problem because the shot hit all the way down here. And I doubt that you can see this on the camera. I'll try to get you a close-up. And when I saw this, I measured it, and it is exactly 25 minutes of angle low, which told me I was 1 complete revolution low on my elevation turret. So I thought I was only about 2/3 of a revolution low, but I was 1 2/3 of a revolution low. So when I corrected to where I thought my 0 was, it was still 1 revolution, meaning 25 minutes of angle low. So I'm not sure exactly what I did wrong when it came to setting the 0 stop for the Vortex Viper. I was following the instruction manual as I did it, just like I was following the instruction manual for the Cvlife scope when I set the 0 stop on it. And one thing I'll mention about the instructions for the Vortex Viper is they are not extremely detailed for as complex as this optic is. And specifically for the 0 stop, the instructions for setting that are in 2 different parts of the manual. Part of it is under the bore sighting section, another part is under the zeroing section, and I found that to be a little bit disjointed. And once again, for a optic in this price range, it shouldn't be that difficult. I shouldn't have to jump back and forth through the manual and watch YouTube videos and everything else to set this thing. It should be easier, especially when I was able to set the 0 stop on a $200 optic much easier, and it worked just fine. Once I figured out what I had done wrong, or what was wrong with the setting for the elevation turret on this scope, I rotated it 1 complete revolution up, and that brought it back to the proper 0, and I fired another shot on my calibrated target, and I'll show you that momentarily. But this morning I took this apart once again here in the shop and tried to figure out why that 0 stop was not stopping. I again tried to reset it, and it's still not stopping at 0. So I'm obviously doing something wrong when it comes to setting that, but as I said, it should not be that difficult. So after reestablishing the proper 0 on the Vortex Viper scope, I decided this time to fire at the very center of my calibrated target, just in case there were any other surprises in store, and this was where the bullet struck this time. So more or less, I'm back to that proper 0 setting. This is a little high, maybe that was me, or maybe something about dialing those turrets all the way up and down and back and forth and everything else caused the shot to be a little high. It's not so much that I'm really concerned about it, but I did note it. The final thing I looked at in my evaluation of these two rifle scopes was their low-level light performance. And this is one category where the Vortex Viper showed a definite advantage over the value-price Cvlife scope. Whether it is better glass or more or improved optic coatings, I don't know, but the image in low light through the Vortex Viper was vastly superior to the Cvlife. The image in the Vortex was clearer, it was sharper, and it was just easier to make out details in very low light than I was able to achieve with the Cvlife. The image through the Cvlife was murky. It was probably usable at least on the lower magnification settings, but it was certainly inferior to the Vortex. While I was in the process of using these scopes under low light conditions, I also took the opportunity to look at the illuminated reticle in those low light settings where the illumination was visible. And if you'll pardon the pun, there were some things that came to light with respect to the reticles that I think bear pointing out in this evaluation. On the lowest illumination setting, and I was looking at these in very low light, the Cvlife scope does not illuminate the entire reticle equally. The cross in the very center of the reticle is brighter than the rest of the reticle. In fact, on the number 1 and number 2 settings, it's very difficult under the lowest magnification to make out the other elements of the reticle, but you can definitely see that brighter cross in the center. And I think this can be both an advantage or a disadvantage depending upon how you're shooting, or maybe I should say the type of shot you're preparing to take. If you are shooting at a known range and you've already set your dials to the proper elevation and wind correction and everything like that, and you're not planning on using the elements of the reticle that would be necessary for an elevation hold or a windage hold or estimating distance or using a moving target lead or what have you, it makes a nice, uncluttered, precise aiming point when you just have that illuminated cross in the very center of your field of view. On the other hand, if you need to use an elevation or windage hold, or you're doing a moving target lead or something like that, you have to turn the brightness up to higher and higher levels. And when you do that, the illuminated cross in the center of the Cvlife scope is still brighter than all of those other elements in the reticle. So if you have to hold, say, 5 minutes of angle high while you're looking through the Cvlife scope, and you're trying to see that 5 minute of angle hash mark on the stadia line, I could see where that brighter cross in the center of the reticle in your field of view could be distracting. But if you don't need to do that, then again, I think that's potentially an advantage under low light conditions. So it all comes down to how you're using the optic, whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. By contrast, the Vortex Viper illuminates all elements of the reticle equally. So there's no part of the reticle that's brighter than any other part. So you can put it in one of those settings between illumination increments, and when you turn it on, it's instantly on the brightness setting that you want, and the entire reticle is illuminated to the same degree. So if you need to use any holds or you're doing range estimation or moving target leads or anything else, you instantly have all portions of the reticle that are available for you to use. It doesn't have that brighter, really precise aiming point if you don't need to use those elements. So you really have to look at how you're going to be using either one of these scopes, particularly with regard to using them in low light and how you might be using them in low light to know whether or not either one of these reticles or the illumination qualities of either one of these reticles is going to be advantageous. As far as the reticles themselves are concerned, and let me reposition the camera quickly. Now, as I started to say, the reticle in either one of these scopes, absent any illumination, are very, very similar. When you look at the Christmas tree style reticle in the Cvlife scope and the Christmas tree style reticle in the Vortex Viper, there's not very much difference between them as long as they are not illuminated. However, I did notice at the range when looking through the Cvlife scope that 1 degree higher magnitude of magnification, that being 16 power in the case of the Cvlife scope, as compared to the highest setting of 15 power in the Vortex Viper, made a noticeable difference. I was able to see more detail under bright sunlight conditions with that 16 power than I was able to with the 15 power. Also, I'll throw in again, before I go completely away from illumination, that particularly when looking at the dots on that calibrated target, I really wish these had sufficient illumination to be able to give me a little bit of contrast between the reticle and those black dots, because it was very difficult with either scope to make out the very center of the reticle and contrast it against that black dot on the target. Also, on the lowest magnification settings, the reticle in the Vortex Viper was noticeably smaller at 3 power than the lowest magnification setting for the Cvlife scope at 4 power. But when I set them both to 4 power, they looked virtually identical. So there was no difference when the magnification was set at the same place. In the end, which of these is going to be the best optic for you largely comes down to you and your use for these scopes and your expectations for their performance. One of the big advantages for the Vortex Viper, at least in my opinion, is the lifetime warranty. If you ever have an issue with this scope, you can send it back to Vortex and they will repair it or replace it, and that's part of what you're paying for with the greater price of this optic. The Cvlife scope has, through Amazon, a 30-day return or replacement policy. Also, you can purchase extended contracts for 2 years or 3 years, during which time they will repair or replace this scope, but that's when it ends. Through Cvlife, there is a 1-year manufacturer warranty, and that's it. But you could literally buy several of these scopes for the price of one Vortex Viper. So again, it really depends on you. If you're looking at using this during adverse lighting conditions, definitely the Vortex Viper has the advantage. If that's never a concern and you're only going to be using them on bright sunny days on the range, it's really a tie between these two. I did not see any greater advantage one way or the other. As far as which one is more durable, I would hope that the Vortex Viper is more durable, but it would really take an extended evaluation over a great deal of time using these under demanding and adverse conditions to see whether or not the Cvlife scope was going to hold up as well as the Vortex Viper. And again, if you're never going to be using them for anything other than going to the range and shooting under nice conditions, and there's not going to be a lot of rough handling or anything else, I think you're probably dollars ahead to go with the less expensive scope. It certainly performs better than those inexpensive scopes that I talked about when I conducted my review of this optic that I used years and years ago. So there has been a tremendous increase in the quality that you'll see in these type of scopes. I think there is better machining in the Vortex Viper scope, as we would expect. When I talk about how I had the difficulty getting the cap off the turret on the elevation turret for this scope, and then trying to get it back on and it not going on and having to jiggle and force it down on and everything else. That's probably one area where we see an advantage for the machining that was very noticeable when I was working with the Vortex Viper over and above the Cvlife. I much prefer the Windage turret of the Cvlife scope to that of the Vortex Viper, especially when it comes to re-indexing it to 0. But even when I'm not doing that, just being able to lock it in place and not have to worry about it being bumped or moved or anything else, I like a lot. I wish they did the same thing with the elevation turret on this scope, and really I would like to see something like that on the Vortex Viper. I very much prefer the 0 stop on the Cvlife scope to that on the Vortex Viper, which I've still not been able to properly set. And as I said repeatedly before, it should not be that difficult for a scope in this price range. Lastly, what I'll mention is with the Cvlife scopes, you get the rings. Whether or not that's something that is important to you probably depends a lot on you. I didn't see a problem with these rings. That's one less thing you have to buy. So you buy your scope for $200 from Cvlife, or actually from Amazon. It comes with the rings. You install it on your rifle and you're ready to go shooting. Whereas with the Viper, you're going to have to come up with different rings or another mount or something like that. So in the final analysis, like I said, a lot of it comes to you. I don't have any problem at all using the Cvlife scope. The Vortex Viper, I think, is probably a better optic, but there are certainly some things about it that I do not like, and I would like to see Vortex change. So that's going to do it for this video, and that's the wrap up to this series. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions or comments, make sure you forward those to me. Remember to stop by hrfunk.com for all of the information listed there, along with more product information and also some numbers listed on the product information page that might help you out with some of your purchases. In any case, see you next time, folks, and until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.